turned away because I didn't really know how to articulate my purpose or to ask people for permission to be part of their lives. But eventually, I met a couple families that were open enough to let me in, and I just kind of latch on, and I would stick with them for as long as I could. So this is a photograph from 2006. This is the Goins family moving a new trailer into place where they were living in Chauncey, Ohio. This kind of muddy patch in the yard was where they previously had a trailer home that was crashed into by a drunk driver, and so they had to tear it down and bring this new home in. And fast forward 4 years, this is Richie in what was his mom's trailer. This was after she'd passed away, and it had kind of fallen into disrepair and was being used as sort of a hub for opioids and oxys that were being traded back and forth. So this photograph was made after I graduated from school, and I would just go and spend time with this family whenever I was in Ohio, catching up and seeing how life was going for them. But I was always the outsider with the camera, sitting there, chain smoking cigarettes in the living room, and people would be coming and going, wondering who I was and if I was a cop, and how much they could trust me and all of that. This is the Sellers family home in Columbus, Ohio. This is one of the twins, Casey and Lacey, who you'll see later, and they're bathing the ferrets here. This was one of the early photographs I made in the series. This is Jesse Jr. in the kitchen after winning a dirt bike race. And this was a photograph that I made for his mom, essentially. I thought this would be the kind of photograph that she would want to have of her son. And I realized after the fact that it was better than any of the pictures that I made for myself that day. And so I started thinking then about kind of how I might be coming into situations and projecting my own wants or needs or assumptions onto people. And that realization has helped kind of shape my interactions with folks over the years, where it's a lot of dialogue about how do you see yourself? How do you think that other people see you? And then I bring back prints for people whenever I can as a way of saying, this is how I see you. Does this line up with your self-image? So this kid is now 19 and in the Marines. This is one of his younger sisters standing on a skid mark that her daddy had left behind. This is back at the Goins family home. They're using one of the little dudes as a measuring stick to see how deep that hole is. This was after prom in Nelsonville, Ohio. I'd been assigned to do an essay on this town by one of my professors, and I was just really struggling, and I walked out of the prom thinking that I hadn't made anything. And from across the parking lot, I saw this Cinderella-looking girl with this dress standing under the light, so I just broke into a dead sprint to get there in time to make this photograph. But this is an example of how photographs are capable of lying as well. Like, if you read this photograph, it's pretty easy to read heartbreak, breakup, he's leaving her in the dust or something, but they probably knew one another because they were in class together, but they weren't there at the prom together. This is Clayton riling his dogs, shanking money. This was in a cabin in Carbondale, Ohio, where Clayton, who was an ex-con, was doing prison-style tattoos out of the living room. And I ended up there because I went with the father of these kids and that I showed you previously. He wanted to get a new tattoo, and I thought we were going to go to a tattoo parlor like normal folks. And he was like, no, we're going to Carbondale. And so I met this guy, Clayton, and started going back and hanging out there on my own as well. So that's sort of how these projects kind of ripple out over time. I'll find a person or a group of people that I really connect with. They bring me into their lives, and then eventually they'll kind of start introducing me to other people, and the project spreads. But I've been making this work for a couple of years before it all seemed to mentally connect for me. And it was when I was trying to edit some of the work down, and I was thinking about things in a very kind of compartmentalized way. There's this family, and that's one story, and there's this family, and that's another story. And a friend of mine said, hey, man, I never looked at these pictures all together and thought about what they share in common instead of maybe what you're using to kind of keep them apart from one another. And then he brought up this song, Carry Me Ohio by Sun Kill Moon, which is a song I'd listened to numerous times before, but I'd never listened to it while thinking about the photographs. And so I put it on, and something clicked for me. And I realized that all of these disparate projects that I'd been making were actually the same thing. They were about the same place, and some of the same themes kind of went throughout them. So I make my living by doing a bunch of different things. I'm a photographer, and that means that I have to apply for grants, and I do assignments for publications, and I'll do commercial work whenever it falls out of the sky, and I teach, and it's this constant juggle. And occasionally I'll sell prints, but there's no one kind of revenue stream that actually supports my family and supports the work that I want to do. But on rare occasions, I'll get an assignment to go photograph something that actually overlaps with a project. So this is an example of that, where AARP sent me to hang out with this gentleman, Guy McRoberts, and in his town they had this rally for a fallen soldier, and so I was just kind of tagging along with him, but then was able to photograph this larger community event that's still connected to the work that I was making. This is Hercules out of the kitchen window from the seller's home. That's medicine bottles on the windowsill. This is back in Carbondale in that same cabin. So when I met Clayton, I also met this young guy named Tyler. And in repeated visits, I kept noticing this strange box that was in the house. And eventually I worked up the nerve to ask Tyler, what's that about? And he said, oh, that's my dad. And I was like, oh, hold up a second. You're going to need to explain more. He's like, oh, that's my dad. He was killed in a four-wheeling accident. We had his body cremated and put in that box. That's his favorite cockfighting rooster that we stuffed and mounted on top. So it's hard to kind of see in the photograph, but his name's written in Sharpie on the side of the box. And that was their kind of memorial to him, and they kept him with them. And Tyler was probably 16 when I made this photograph. And it took me years to bring this work back to Ohio in any sort of tangible form, but last year I did a show of the work at my alma mater, and apparently Tyler's younger sister went there with a group of students and saw this photograph, not knowing that her brother was in the show. And then she reached out to me to tell me that he had been incarcerated for 4 years at that point, so he's on a 5-year bit. He doesn't get out until 2019. But after I'd stopped photographing there, that house had kind of been turned into a meth cookhouse. There was an explosion that almost killed a child. It burned the place to the ground. And Tyler got arrested and sent away for a while. And he was a very sweet kid. When I met him, I knew that he was kind of trying to figure out who he was and what path he was going to set foot on as an adult. But I'm really curious to know how he's going to function in society when he gets out. So this is Casey and Lacey. This is on a snow day. And they were from that first family that ever really let me into their lives in an intimate way. But I was especially drawn to them because they're identical twins and they were born deaf. And I was very curious about how they were going to survive in this really tough environment, especially with a disability. So I've followed that family now for 11 years, and I'm kind of interested in seeing them kind of grow into adulthood and what their life would look like if they weren't living at home with their parents. This is Elvis the zebra. He lives at a place called the Wilds, which is 10,000 acres of reclaimed strip mine that have been turned into a conservation and research facility. So if you visit Cumberland, Ohio, and you want to go see zebras and giraffes and strange exotic animals that don't belong in Ohio, you can do a little safari and wander around the hills there. But this is during the winter months when it's closed to the public, and most of the animals are kept indoors, but they're given these little kind of stomping grounds outside so they can get fresh air. This is back in the Goins family home. This was Johnny shortly after being released from prison, where he got this tattoo. So that's a brief summary of 10 years of work, and each one of these little chapters that I'm going to show you all is a very condensed version of what is supposed to be coming out in book form. So Carry Me, Ohio was released in 2016, and on the table kind of around the corner I've put one of the last show copies that I have of that, and a couple other books that I've been working on. So this next volume, Sin, Salvation in Baptist Town, is set in Greenwood, Mississippi, and the work spans 7 years from 2010 to 2017, and that book comes out this October. So it's actually on press in Germany right now and being bound in the next weeks before being shipped to the States. So this is something that I've been really working on for the last couple months, trying to carve out time to work on text and finalizing the edit and getting contributions from essayists and folks to kind of round out my perspective a little bit of this place. So again, my bread and butter is editorial work primarily, and AARP isn't maybe the most glamorous brand for editorial publications, but they really love photography. They've got a great budget, and they're pretty open-minded about what they do with photography. And one of my favorite editors works there, so he sent me to Greenwood, Mississippi in early 2010 for a piece about rural healthcare. And while there, I met some people that just brought me straight into their homes without hesitation, like, hey, who are you? Come to my kitchen, watch me cook. Let me introduce you to this person. Let me tell you this story. Did you hear about this? And the longer I spent with these folks, the more curious I became about kind of our really convoluted and racist history and the way that that embodies itself in this small southern town that was formerly segregated and still bears a lot of the visual signs of that segregation. So I spent most of my time in one neighborhood called Baptistown, which is literally where The Help lived. And if any of you have seen the movie The Help, part of it was filmed in that neighborhood because it still looks like 1963. So the people that I met in Baptistown just opened their doors and their lives to me, and I kept coming back on my own after that assignment. And again, bringing prints back to show them how I saw them and to kind of engage with them on that level. And then I realized that a lot of the young people would photograph my pictures with their phones so they could put it up on Facebook. I was like, let's just be Facebook friends, and then I can post the pictures and y'all can tag whoever you want. And in future visits, I started finding my pictures on t-shirts and like random places where I just didn't expect to find them. But always one of the largest compliments for me would be walking into somebody's home and then finding one of my pictures tucked into a mirror, like behind a frame or something, like on a dresser. This is Ellen cooking in her kitchen. This is Fat Man's First Steps. This is my friend Nikki. She's throwing up the sign for Baptistown BT. And that's the late afternoon sun coming through, smoke from cigarettes and hamburgers. This is Quan waking up. This was an image made late at night, hanging out in the neighborhood, kind of just on the corner with some of the young guys. And there aren't a ton of young women that walk around late at night in that neighborhood for a lot of reasons, but this girl walked by the group and the boys start catcalling her, and instead of turning the other way, she like leaned into it. She jumped up on the hood of the car and like struck this pose. And so again, I thought I was going to make a picture to bring a print for her, and I completely screwed up my exposure and ended up with something a lot more interesting than I actually tried for. And that's something that I think is really important in the way that I work, is just trying to make room for mistakes, because if everything turns out exactly as I anticipate, then I get really bored. And oftentimes it's just too expected. This is Quan before church. This is in a little one-room bar that's attached to a house. It's called Odessa's Place. It's this sweet little old lady named Odessa Nix that runs this, it's almost like a juke joint, but not quite. There's just enough room for a pool table, a jukebox, and a few tables. So this was the funeral for a young man named Demetrius Butta Anderson. He was 18 when he was killed. He was the third person in his family to be murdered. So one of the things that I realized really quickly in this place was that violence was kind of part of their life and their community. And it's evolved over the years. You know, like the older folks that lived there had like lived through kind of the crack epidemic and seen violence that was associated with that. But most of the older folks that I talked to seemed to think that the young folks these days just didn't have any rules or any boundaries, and everything was like rougher and more violent than when they had grown up. But for a lot of these young guys that I was hanging out with, they had never lost anybody as close as Buddy. He was a really popular kid in the neighborhood, but he was definitely somebody who was pretty rough and tumble. Like the person that had killed him, he had had a fight with the year before, and he'd hospitalized this guy, and so he'd just kind of been waiting for his opportunity for revenge. But since this funeral, I actually found out recently that the young man on the right in the dark suit was murdered as well in a case of mistaken identity. He has an identical twin brother, and somebody was gunning for his brother but killed him instead. This is my buddy Dexter at the club. He's lighting the hookah for the ladies. Dexter is a pretty popular guy, and whenever he got wind of me coming to town, he'd be like, "There's a party going on here tonight. Why don't you come and bring your camera?" And I don't really have pictures of Winky in this edit, but this is Winky's shadow and two of his kids in the house. And Winky Williams is one of the main characters kind of running through this work, and one of the reasons that I was able to make a lot of these photographs, because he always kind of had my back, and I knew that he was looking out for me. This is my friend Ellen after her stroke. So when I met her, she was still pretty active in the community, and then not long after that, she had a stroke and was bedridden for a number of years. So usually when I would arrive there, I would park my car and then just go to her house and kind of sit and catch up with her in her bedroom for a while. This is the morning after Buddha's wake. It's Jabari, Kwan, and Ellen at the kitchen table. And this is on the corner late at night. So while I was making those photographs, I was kind of ping-ponging back and forth between my home in Virginia and Mississippi, and then running around for assignments as well, but looking for any excuse I could find to stay home and be around my family more, because a lot of these projects are very time-consuming and kind of energy-consuming as well. And I wanted to start unpacking the place that I grew up, which is southeastern Virginia, Hampton Roads, an area that they used to call the Seven Cities. So what I did is I proposed a project or a collaboration with a local museum, and that was kind of a shift for me because I usually think about things in book form as a final product. But the museum agreed to work with me on this, and so I started jumping around to all kinds of different community events, basically anything I could find that was remotely of interest, but without the expectations of an editor or a publication. I felt a little more open-ended and free to kind of pursue what I wanted. So this was at the Senior Olympics. I thought I was going to go there to photograph cute older folks swimming and competing, but instead I was drawn to this really lanky guy giving out the medals, and so I spent all my time photographing him. This was outside of the International Tattoo. This is a fire hose baptism in Newport News, Virginia. And for anybody that hasn't seen a fire hose baptism, if you ever get a chance, I would highly recommend it. It's really beautiful. There's like a brass band, and they've got fire hoses at each end of the street, and everybody's dressed in white, kind of dancing and singing. This was a sports event for wounded veterans. And the town that I was living in, Norfolk, is home to the largest naval base in the world, so a lot of that kind of military influence of the politics and the economy of the region kind of filtered into the work. This was also the first body of work where I felt like I could bring my own family and my own personal experience into the photographs. So this is my wife and youngest daughter. This is my father in the river. This was my backdoor neighbor at the time. The woman on the right is a close friend named Amanda Lucier, who's a really wonderful photographer, photojournalist. She lives in Portland. And that was her boyfriend at the time, Josh, who was in the military. So she knew about my project, and I knew that she and Josh were going to go to this fancy event, and she was kind enough to still let me into their lives and let me be a part of them getting ready for this. And this was one of the last photographs I made before they left for the military ball, but there was something in the tension between her gesture and his expression that really spoke to me about this photograph. And working on this project gave me an excuse just to always be photographing when I was out with family. So this was at the Christmas parade. It's my wife and older daughter in the middle, and then I've got the younger one strapped to my chest while I was making this. This is my little brother with some of his friends. A basketball tournament. One thing I'd like to mention is that after years and years of working on these projects, I kind of lose myself in the work a little bit, where I can't really make sense of what pictures function together or even what the best pictures are in the work. And so oftentimes what I'll do is I gather everything into a pile and then I take it to a photo editor that I trust, that knows how to read my photographs and pair things together. And I work with this really brilliant guy named Mike Davis, who is formerly a photo editor at the Oregonian in town here, and that's actually where I met him over a decade ago. And Mike does things like find sounds in photographs and pairs photographs like these together, which I never would have seen or thought. So this is another example of what I go looking for and what I find are often not the same thing. I went to this rap battle in a civic center thinking that was going to be really visual and cool, but I got inside and it was not that interesting and the light was terrible, and feeling kind of bummed and disappointed with myself, I walked around the back of the building and found these young dudes outside playing basketball, all more than happy to be in a picture. So this final volume, so the past thing that we just looked at, the 7 cities, should be released next year in book form, probably in the fall. And then this final volume, We the Free, is one that diverges from the others in that it's not so geographically specific. It's about America at large, and this work will continue through 2020. And my goal is to release this right before the next presidential election as kind of my statement about how I fear that America's moving as a country. So these images are drawn from personal projects and assignments and random travels, and they were images that I kind of thought of as orphan photographs for a long time, pictures that didn't have a house to live in or a home to belong to. But over time, they've started to develop relationships with one another as I continue adding to the pile and mixing them together and trying to see what they do as a unit. This is my grandfather on his 89th birthday. That's his girlfriend Anne on the side there. This is in Louisiana with some alligator hunters. It was part of a project that I pursued in between the Ohio work and the Mississippi work, thinking that it would develop into something else, but it ended up being kind of a small, self-contained body of work that didn't really feel like it had the legs to be a book or a show. But it was a very strange experience being out with these guys in the swamps. This is actually in my backyard in Charlottesville, Virginia. This was August 12th of 2017 when the Unite the Right rally came to Charlottesville. So this was in an alleyway just off of the main park where the Lee statue is, and this was kind of the first violence of that day. So the guy with the sunglasses here in the corner, it's hard to see in the photograph, but he's got a piece of pipe taped into his hands, and he just wrapped that woman straight on the head, and she collapsed with her head split wide open. And so this was, like the counter-protesters clashing with the neo-Nazis for the first time that day. This is in a club in Manassas, Virginia. This is actually a childhood friend of mine who hosted a buddy and me when we were driving across the country. This was early in the morning before we left to continue the drive. The car in the background was our wheels for this ride, and you can tell from the trash bag over the window we'd gotten broken into the night before. Somebody grabbed my bag out of the car but didn't see the very expensive camera that was hiding just beneath the bag. So they took my bag and they left $4,000 worth of camera gear on the floor. So I felt like I dodged a bullet with that one. This guy was throwing holy powder at the Lee statue until the cops made him stop. This was the day after the Unite the Right rally. Here we are in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania on Groundhog Day. This is a strip club in Tampa, Florida. This was in the aftermath of the Joplin tornado, which killed over 100 people. And this was on the site of a church where the walls collapsed over the nursery, killing 2 nursery workers and several children. And they left this chair with a hymnal open to Amazing Grace in that spot. This is a family praying before breakfast on a Sunday morning in Alabama. And this was after Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson in the protests there. The cops were rounding up protesters, and the media is just there getting in the way for the most part. This is my grandfather and his girlfriend, Anne. I was staying with him while I was working on an assignment in North Carolina and kind of using that opportunity to make photographs of them because I really wanted to document their relationship. I thought it was very interesting for the longest time. They've been together for 15 years or something at this point, but they still have separate homes and separate checking accounts, and they split the check at dinner. And so he was totally fine with me making a project about them, but she was worried about keeping up appearances for her girlfriend, so she put the kibosh on it pretty quickly. But I still got to make this photograph, which I feel like is probably enough. I have my wife to thank for this photograph. She called me from her commute to work one morning and said, "You might want to put on pants and go see what's going on outside." There's these guys being punished by their drill instructor. This is outside of the Sweetwater Rattlesnake Roundup in Texas. Went there to photograph snakes and ended up photographing goofy dudes in caskets. So this prank that they do every year is they set up their RVs and they put this casket outside and they've got a fake body that lays in there, and then they wait for somebody to drive by and kind of do a double take, and then somebody puts on a mask and jumps in to scare the shit out of whoever comes by. So those 4 chapters that I showed you are all part of one kind of larger body of work called The Invisible Yoke, and my interest with that work is really trying to unpack some of our collective memories as Americans and thinking about what connects us instead of what divides us, because I feel like what we're being told right now is these people are different than you, they have different beliefs, don't trust that person, they don't look like you. And honestly, it's all lies, and we need to understand that we share so much in common just as human beings, but also as Americans. And I think that we have a really kind of conveniently forgetful memory as a country. We like to pretend like we're running around doing wonderful things for the rest of the world when denying that we've wiped out an entire native population and enslaved, generations of people, and we're still kind of perpetuating these problems for future generations. So that's what that work deals with on some level. So the work that's hanging out front and that I'm about to show you all is kind of a departure from the previous work that I was making, and it's on an aesthetic level, but also in my approach and just overall. So this work was made mostly from 2015 to 2017 when I was in graduate school. And for anybody that's gone through an MFA program, it's kind of a difficult time to maintain who you are and, not get completely depressed about your work and your purpose in life. So in addition to being in graduate school, my family and I moved to a new place. My parents separated after 33 years of marriage, and then my last living grandparent passed away during that time. So I feel like this work, in many ways, is a time capsule of a really difficult period in our family trajectory. but making these photographs was one way that I could kind of deal with that and reconcile some of the questions that I was having. So I transitioned from making mostly color 35mm photographs that were documentary in nature, where I wasn't controlling anything. It was just, I was there and observing for the most part. And with this work, I began blending more of a staged narrative perspective along with the documentary approach. And I also started bringing myself into the photographs, which, for those of us that don't like being in front of the camera, that's a really awkward experience. So this is an example of a picture that I would not have made prior to this body of work, and I started thinking about family rituals and things that we would do on a regular basis and the way that that could be translated into a photograph. And so one of the things that my wife does for me on the regular is she just shaves my head, keeps me clean. You know, I'll travel for a few weeks, come back all scruffy, and she'll sit me down in the backyard and shave my head. And it's this kind of intimate moment where, you know, it's something that we share. She usually has her hand on my shoulder or on my head, she's shaving my head. And the kids are usually running around doing their own thing. So I decided to make a photograph of this, and I've tried multiple times before I made one that I was pleased with. But I set the camera on a tripod, set the focus and the exposure, and I kind of discussed it with the kids in particular, like, this is what we're gonna try and make. And my daughter, Madeline, who's in the shed there, she pushed the shutter button, because I had it set on timer, and then she jumped and kind of struck that pose in the shed. And Mira, the younger one, was supposed to be standing in front of me, but being the strong-willed young lady she is, she just kind of wandered off to do her own thing and made the photograph way more interesting as a result. So one of the things that I realized in this sort of experimentation is that serendipity is where it's at for me. Like, as much as I want to convey something and try and control things, it's really the magic that occurs when you lose control that's interesting to me. So during this period of time, I was making a lot of pictures kind of around where we lived, but I was also looking for echoes of home when I would travel as well. This is a photograph of my grandmother that I found in the trunk in my grandfather's bedroom on the day of his funeral. This was a picture I made while traveling, but again, it made me think back to kind of what my family was going through at that point in time and with the emotional resonance that I was feeling. So a lot of this work actually began with this photograph, which was an experiment. So as I was in graduate school and kind of spinning my wheels trying to find a new way to express myself and what I was interested in at that moment, I had a conversation with a professor where he said, if you're trying to reinvent yourself, think about everything that works in your practice, everything that you lean on as a crutch, and strip it away. So if your mobility works for you, the fact that you can be kind of light on your feet and constantly moving and recomposing, then like lock it down on a tripod. If color works for you, strip that away. If you like being behind the camera, make yourself vulnerable, put yourself in front. And so this picture was made with the father of the deaf twins that I showed you earlier. This is back in Ohio, and I'd spent the day photographing them, kind of wrapping up the Ohio book. And then at the end of the day, I was like, you want to have some fun and just do something different? And he's like, sure. He like went into his closet, pulled out all his guns, and just like started drinking beers and smoking cigarettes and just playing around. And so again, I set the camera, set the exposure, set the focus, and then I turned over the shutter release to a friend. And I was like, this is what we're gonna do. I'm gonna wrestle with Jesse. He's probably gonna beat the shit out of me. And just push the button when it feels right. And so this is the resulting photograph. So a lot of people ask what the lines on my daughter's feet are there. She'd been sitting on a wicker chair with her feet folded underneath her. But I think my favorite part of the photograph is this little piece of lint that's coming off of her toenail, which is kind of hard to see on this screen. And this is Madeline in our backyard. That spring there was this enormous kind of caterpillar infestation that happened, and like every time the kids would go outside, they'd be scooping up fistfuls of these things and like putting them on one another and carrying them into the house, and I was always scared the younger one was just gonna be like, ha ha ha, and squeeze them all over the place, but managed to avoid any tragedies. This is my dad in the place that he's living now that he and my mom have separated. And this was a photograph made after they separated as well, but they came together for my sister's birthday. This is in our backyard, probably a couple feet away from where I made the picture of the bug on Madeline's back. And this picture was a complete accident, but again, kind of trying to figure out how photography is as magical as it is. So my dad was tossing the ball with my daughter, and I was really studying their kind of like body language together. I was really interested in how they were next to one another, but there was this chasm emotionally between them, and my mom's on the phone, kind of detached from the whole interaction and leaning away from him. And he's kind of caught up in this interaction with my daughter. And as I was about to push the button, my brother-in-law, off to the side of the camera, took this bubble blower and just threw it in front of the lens. And so right as the flash popped, this bubble took most of the frame up, and that's where these orbs came from. I'm not smart enough to have thought of that or to have tried to stage this photograph. It just happened. And somehow it kind of perfectly encapsulated the way that I was feeling about their relationship and my fears for my own relationship, that love is doomed and like relationships are all too fragile to survive and all of that kind of stuff. But in general, the fact that we do live in these little bubbles that can just burst at any moment, right? So a few years before I made this photograph, my dad showed up on the front porch with a fishbowl and a betta fish. He set it down and said, "This is so you can teach your kids about death." So, thanks, Dad. I really appreciate that. And of course, that fish lived for like 2 years. And when he died, my daughter was traumatized. She definitely had her first real brush with mortality. So it was a pretty formative experience for her. And then they replaced the original fish, Jack, with another fish named Jack Jr., who was nowhere near as long-lived as his predecessor. And for whatever reason, we didn't know what to do with Jack Jr. when he passed away, so we just set him to bake in the sun outside for a day or so. And I was sitting outside, lost in my thoughts, smoking a cigarette, and then turned and looked next to me, and I was like, oh, there's a picture. I should probably go get my camera now, I guess. And that's the way that a lot of this stuff happens, is I'm just kind of like blindly going through life, and then occasionally my eyes will open, and I see that there's pictures all around me. And I feel that can be a really crippling realization when you're constantly feeling like you have to be making something, but it's also an amazing way to feel alive, to realize that we're always surrounded by moments of meaning and beauty, even in death, and this like rotting betta fish sitting in the sun on the back porch. There's some meaning to be drawn from that. This is a portrait of my wife in the tub. A lot of people that don't know us or don't know like the backstory of the work will read all kinds of different things into this photograph. You could read that she's crying, or you could read domestic abuse, but she's literally just in the tub and splashed water on her face, and that's her mascara running. And she is an amazing partner and incredibly giving of herself to me with the pictures that she allows me to make and share with others. And it's a constant kind of dialogue that we have about, like, how do you feel about this photograph? What do you see in this photograph? Is it okay to share this photograph with other people? And sometimes she'll say, no, that one doesn't leave the house. But yeah, she's constantly giving herself to me and to others through these photographs. And in the course of this work, I went through these funny little phases where I just kept repeating myself for whatever reason. So when I made this portrait of Melissa, it was during a phase where all of the pictures were confrontational portraits, mostly where my children and my wife were kind of exhibiting what I would describe as like disappointment with me. But it was really me projecting that feeling onto them and like waiting for the moment when I saw it. And there, I'm disappointed in me too. So now I have proof of this. It's this weird psychological thing. So I went through this whole phase of making these really direct portraits, and then I went through this whole other phase where it's like nobody's faces in any pictures, and for whatever reason I just kept putting things in front of people's faces. So I'd like go to the Christmas celebration with family and I would only shoot like the bag in front of my sister's face, or would wait for these moments where something obscured the person that I was actually trying to photograph. And I'm not smart enough to tell you why I kind of fell into these little patterns, but when I started to spread the work out a little bit and look at it with a stepped back perspective, then I realized that they all function together. You know, the details, the portraits, these kind of obscured faces, some of the landscapes, but I was just responding to whatever I was seeking emotionally at the time with what I was photographing. So this is Melissa after we took the kids for a swim at my mom's house. And of course, again, I'm not smart enough to see a lot of these things in pictures. I was just like, oh, I love the texture and the frame within the frame. Would you stand here for a portrait? And then realizing afterwards that that bundle of wet kids' clothes almost looks like a bouquet, and she almost looks like a bride on her wedding day. And there's all of these layers to a photograph that I don't necessarily consciously recognize as I'm making it, but there's some subconscious aspect to it where, again, I have to live with it and listen to the photographs. This is my parents after they put their dog to sleep. This is the butterfly that my older daughter and one of her friends captured. Of course, I'm like, you know you need to let it go, but just wait a second, I need to make a picture first real quick. This is the kids in my childhood wardrobe. So I've got 3 more photographs. This kind of marks the end of what I'm sharing that's in the book and in the exhibition. So even though that work is technically done, it still continues. I don't really know where it's going or what's going to become of it, but these are 3 photographs that I made over the summer with family. This is my sister embracing my mother. This is one of my other sisters. All the kids at a splash pad. And this is a portrait of my daughter, Madeline. So I don't really see an end date to this work. I feel like being in that MFA program kind of like set me on this different path of seeing and working, and I'm just going to keep making that as long as I can, as long as they tolerate me. And, you know, I'm hoping to continue photographing these kids into adulthood and see what becomes of life. But this is what I've got for y'all today. I would love to chat and have a conversation about any questions you may have, and then we've got some books on the table right outside here. Yeah.
Anybody have any questions? All right, let's begin.
Kind of curious now that you've sort of trained the camera more on yourself and your family, not that there's inherently a problem there, but how do you sort of navigate the present and the future, sort of thinking about, you know, potential issues of, you know, you mentioned how your wife has sort of final say if a picture goes or not, but I mean with kids it's a little different, and yourself, and just how do you kind of navigate sort of imagining once you let the work go, you know, how to make peace with that, or, you know, if you have to struggle with that.
I mean, that's always a struggle. Like, you have this sort of ownership of the work up until it goes out into the world, and then who's to say how people are going to read it, right? So I'm always trying to be conscious of that, and the older the kids get, the more engaged they are in the process. So even the younger one at age 5 will still like creep in behind me in the studio, and I'll be working on a picture or something, and she'll just like show up and be like, "What's that? Who's that? Tell me what that's about." And I love to get her involved and engaged. So I was actually just telling somebody earlier about, I did a little editing process preparing for this book where I made a bunch of really bad laser prints, teeny tiny ones, spread them out all over the floor, and then I gave my daughter a book of stickies, like little sticky stars like you'd get on a well-done paper, you know, in elementary school or something, and I gave her different color stars to my wife. And I said, just put stars on the backs of the ones that you respond to. And then that way, and I walked out of the room and let them do their thing, and then I could come back in and be like, well, both of them responded to this photograph, neither of them responded to that photograph. And we can have conversations about what they see and what they feel about the images. I know they already enjoy looking back and be like, wow, we were so small, or do you remember this? And so I can kind of see them having these experiences that I remember rooting me in photography, that feeling of being emotionally transported back to something that happened to you before. I have no idea how they're going to feel about these pictures in 10, 20 years. Like, I certainly hope that they get some iota of feeling from them, you know, like my love for them as a father.
I guess, I mean, I don't want to dominate, but I worry, or I think it might be a worry as you become more successful, the idea of celebrity, or, you know, that later people will be, I saw that picture of you, you know, or, you know, that it might change with time, or do you contemplate that? Does that concern you, or?
I don't worry about becoming a celebrity. Right. Yeah. I follow what you're asking. Yeah, it's certainly a concern and something that I'm trying to engage them with more and more. And I'm sure like the older they get, the more opinions they're going to have about what they want out in the world. And I'm just going to have to respect that because my relationship with them comes first. And the fact that they let me photograph them and just hang out with them and experience life with them is gift enough, you know.
Hi. I just want to say I'm a photographer from Croatia, and I worked on one project like for 1 year, and one moment I start, and my mentor, he bring your name to me, and he say like, watch his work, maybe it will give you some inspiration, and like you free your mind, and you really did to me, and I have 2 daughters, they were here, sorry for yelling.
It made it more real. I appreciate that.
And actually, I made an exhibition, it's inspired by your work, so thank you.
Thank you, that's very sweet. Appreciate that.
Anybody else have questions?
What's up, Callie? How are you?
Has your move to Charlottesville changed your work?
Yes and no. So it felt like a different phase for family life for sure, and I feel like we're finally putting down roots. We're actually trying to close on a home there this week, and a whole bunch of other stuff all at once. But yeah, we love it there. It's been a good fit for the kids. I've kind of seen them blossom into like new people almost over the 3 years that we've been there. And that's kind of how it connects to the family stuff, I guess. But aside from that, like I've been wandering around America feeling this kind of rising racial tension for a decade and always trying to put my finger on what was at the root of that. And then when August 12th happened last year, I'm from that area, and I was still surprised as shit that just popped up in my backyard and kind of manifested all of these things that I'd kind of heard whispered, and like all of these kind of, you know, hateful sentiments that I'd heard over the years from different people. And I thought, you know, that's just like a one-off, that person's just kind of like an isolated kook or whatever. But like then it manifested itself in a really in a very real way in my backyard. And that, yeah, but it's something I'm still trying to deal with and understand and unpack. But it took me weeks after that event to really put my head back together and go out into the community and feel like it was okay. And I think one of the things that brought me around was the eclipse happened 10 days after that event, and I took the kids to the park, the same place where all of that stuff went down, and we all saw the eclipse there together, and it was like the whole community in one place. And yeah, I don't know, it was a real emotional experience for me to see people come together in love and kind of wonderment in the wake of all of that.
Can you talk about trying to earn a living?
That is a
Sorry,
hot
it's so
topic.
practical.
No, I mean, it's practical as hell because we gotta eat, right? Like, if you can't support yourself or support your family, then we can't make the work. Yeah, I'm constantly struggling with that, and I try and think about, like, the whole industry is this large pie, and, you know, there's certain portions of it that I'm engaged with and others that I'm not. So, like, I'm not a wedding photographer, I don't want to be, but if somebody called me and asked me to shoot their wedding, I'd be like, sure. Same for commercial work, you know, I'm not showing a commercial portfolio around and trying to present myself as something I'm not. I'm just making my work and showing it and hoping that people find something they can connect to in that, and if they want to hire me to make something like that, then wonderful. But yeah, as I said, I realized that no single income stream is enough to support my family and to keep these projects going. So most of the work that I showed to y'all was created with support from grant funding. And I may apply for 15 to 20 grants a year, and I'm lucky if I get one. And sometimes it'll be 2 or 3 years, and there's no grant funding, and so I'm just paying out of my own pocket to make work during that time. But I sell prints and, you know, do these assignments, and I started teaching after graduate school. And that's certainly not nearly as lucrative as I would have liked to have believed that, you know. So just, you know, all of these different things and still trying to be home as much as possible. So it's a constant journey trying to get to some place where I feel like I can balance my creative wants with my family's needs. But I had a professor in college that I always think about when I get to that idea of balance, because he seemed to have it pretty well figured out. Was like, had 2 kids, had a job, had his personal work, and he was always giving of his time to his students. And I asked him how he did it one day, and he's like, Matt, balance is an illusion. There's no such thing. It's up to you to know what suffers at any given moment. And I was like, oh, you know, like, that's not what you want to hear as a 19-year-old, like, with these ideas that you, like, eventually arrive somewhere, and life is easy, and, like, it just isn't that way. And honestly, the more time I've worked in the photo industry, the less I want to play in the photo industry. There's just enormous flaws in the editorial system, the commercial system, the fine art world. There's just like, everywhere you look, it's kind of rotten from the inside, and so I keep wanting to pull away from it, but it's my language. It's the only way that I really know how to express myself, and so I keep trying to find new ways to do it, but I haven't figured out a solution, really. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. And I guess I'm most interested. Your website has a lot of scholarship, fellowship awards, and you know, was that path worth the time? Did those fundings help?
I think so, and partially for me, like I'm not a great writer. It's like a really slow, painful process for me to write about my work, and it's taken me a lot of practice to figure out how to speak about my work. And grant writing forces you to be really succinct and to the point and cut away all of the bullshit so that you get right to the core of what your work is about. And you just know that it's kind of like, I don't know what this judge or juror is going to eat for breakfast this morning, but that's going to determine what they like and they don't like. You know, like, once you put it out there, again, it's kind of out of your hands and out of control. So it's almost like fishing, right? You throw enough lines in the water, something's going to bite eventually, is the hope. But my thought process is apply sometimes 7 to 10 times before something happens, but each application better be better than the one before. So I'll go back to the last year's application, I'll look at the edit, I usually shudder, cringe, and then I kind of grab what I'd started with, and then I gut it, and I start over and try and make it better than it was the last time. And sometimes that works. Usually I get a rejection letter, you know, after I'd forgotten that I applied, and like, thanks for that kick in the pants, I needed that. Yeah, rejection is the daily diet of the freelance photographer.
How do you deal with it when you're working on a long-term body of work and you've been showing it on and off over the years?
there becomes a thing where people are like, oh, I know that work, you know, you have, what are you doing now, what's new, what's next, right? And they don't want to really hear about it. And so there's like, and everybody also wants to be the first to show anything, like, what do you have that's fresh that I can take first, right? When you're applying for grants and such, it's the same thing, right? They're like, oh, well, we already know that, why would we, want to, support you in that? How do you deal with that? Because you are working on things for a very long term, like many people. So.
It's hard to say. I mean, so the Ohio work, I'd applied for this Getty Images grant for editorial photography 6 or 7 times, maybe, with the same work. And I had heard that it got to the final rounds before. And I did end up getting it eventually, but I actually stopped applying with that work because I figured it was never going to go anywhere. And I applied with something else and got an early grant for the Baptist Town work through that. And then I was like, I'll try again, but I'm going to try again with this thing that they've rejected 7 times before. So just, again, tweaking it and trying to improve it.
And then also because you already have a book out for someone to work too, right? Like,
the book wasn't out at that point, so it actually was the seed money that allowed me to print that book. Miraculously enough, it allowed me to finish the project and print the book. And I had big goals that were part of the proposal, including like making billboards, and of course there wasn't enough money to do all of that, so like then I have to kind of adapt my kind of dissemination approach a bit. The photo industry is really kind of small-minded in terms of what they consider publishable, or like, oh, so-and-so touched that, now we're not going to, and I try not to get too caught up in it.
There's one publication, and we're their competition, we're not interested in that.
Exactly.
Like,
right. And it's just kind of silly. So as much as I can, I distance myself from that, because otherwise it just gets to feel really petty, and like, again, it's just energy draining, and there's not enough energy to feed on anyhow, so I try and not think about it too much. But I get dejected like anybody else when I'm sending proposals or like pitches to publications, and people literally won't write back. You know, and I'm like, hey, I'm just out here trying to feed my family. Would you please respond to my email? I know you got it.
Can you talk a little bit about, navigating with your subjects and the industry is somebody who describes himself as an introvert, or how that goes?
Can you repeat that question?
So the question was how I navigate relationships with the people that I'm photographing and the industry as a self-described introvert. It's tricky. So I have to become somebody else when I'm meeting people to make their picture, because there's always this voice in the back of my head that's like, oh, don't talk to that person. They don't look too happy today. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they don't want to talk to you. Like, and I'm just making excuses to not engage because I don't want to be rejected, right? And the same thing holds true for industry interactions where, I'll be like, I should probably email that editor and tell them that I'm going to be in this place. And I'm like, no, like, it's a Monday. They have a lot of emails today. Like, wait until Tuesday, and then I just won't send it, right? So graduate school was great because it allowed me to disappear under a rock for 2 years, and then like popped my head back out, looked around, and was like, I'm going back under the rock. But I also need to make money, so people need to know what rock I'm living under and how to get hold of me. And so there's this balance of, like, okay, I gotta feed the beast, and like, put a picture on Instagram once a week, or whatever it is, and I hate it, but still gotta do it, And so I've been trying to get better and like sending postcards this year, and like while I'm out here for the show, I was doing meetings with ad firms and folks that I wouldn't get to meet otherwise. And this was kind of my excuse to be like, hey, if you ever have something that seems like a fit, this is where to find me. But yeah, it's a struggle. I would rather just keep to myself and probably never talk about my work or really show it that much, and it's just not the way that the world works. Like, I have to put it out there, I have to give up control, I have to put myself on the line a little bit, especially when I'm going out and meeting people. And the way that I generally start those relationships is just trying to be really open and vulnerable with folks. And so if I've got the excuse of an assignment to be there, that's a little like push. I need to make this for this client to make them happy so that they'll give me more work. But if I'm on my own, then it's really hard to be like, I'm Joe Schmo, photographer from Virginia. Please, like, let me into your home. I would like to see your bedroom now. Like, it's just really tricky to figure out how, how can we have these human connections? It's really what it boils down to, is like the shared experience. And I want to share intimate experiences with strangers and try and render that into photographs. And it's hard to explain, but through time, I've gotten a little better at articulating that, and through bringing pictures back to people, I can show them the results of that, and that helps, I think. Again, I don't know if that answered your question.
We have time for one more, and then that'll be around afterwards. I think we've got any other questions. But does anybody else have one last question?
I have a question about, I think with the complexity of advanced degrees and, the investment and time and the commitment to living under a rock for a few years, I'm curious about your experience and kind of how that plays into like the landscape of greater higher education, or your opinion.
So essentially, what this MFA experience has done for me, and like how it could be applied to you.
Yeah, I mean, in a place where, in a time where you don't need it per se, and if you are investing in a degree, you want to get your payback in some way, or is it worth it, or has it been worth it to you?
That's a question I ask myself pretty regularly. And, like,
Me too.
it was emotionally a difficult period of time on a lot of levels, and for that reason, I don't think I'd sign up to do it again, right? But what happened is I was pushed so far out of my comfort zone that I started making work that I probably wouldn't have made otherwise. And I don't know if I will ever be able to pay off my student loans. I will definitely be paying them off until my kids are in college. But yeah, it was this whole kind of immersion in a different language of photography than I knew before, and that was incredibly valuable to me. And also just to be part of a cohort of people that were really equally passionate. So it just felt like an extension of my creative family, where like they opened up a new room for me that I could suddenly walk into and try and find new things in. And I think in the world of photojournalism, we're constantly closing things down. It's a very small box in a very large world. And graduate school just let me out of that box a bit, and I'm still trying to figure out what I can do with that now. Like, I still think I conceive of things in a pretty traditional way. I'm not like a conceptual photographer by any stretch. Again, the pictures lead me where I go, not the other way around. So, yeah, and for me, having the ability to teach has been really great, just because I love interacting with students and feeding off their energy. One of my students from my first semester of teaching is actually in the room, which makes me very happy. Yeah, it's hard to say where it'll lead. Of course, my overall goal was to provide more stability for my family so I could be home more, but the adjunct reality has been the opposite of its intent. But who knows what that'll open up to in the future. Thank you all so much for being out here.